Hello all and welcome to EPG Pathshala. In the last session, we dealt with communication, the process of communication, models of communication, media, its role in communication and its types. This session is an extension of those previous sessions, and here we are going to understand another important factor that plays a significant role in the process of communication. The fundamental principle of communication is that the message must be understood by the receiver in the same sense as it was meant by the sender. However, there are certain elements or factors that intervene and hinder the process of communication. They are known as barriers of communication. In this session, we will understand the meaning of barriers of communication, its effects in communication process, and the different types of barriers in communication. At the end of the session, you will be able to state the meaning of barriers of communication, state the effects of barriers of communication, explain the barriers of communication, understand different ways that the communication process can be sidetracked, understand the various ways to overcome the barriers. The effectiveness of communication very much depends on the presence or absence of the elements and conditions facilitating or obstructing the proper flow of communication. These elements or situations effectively play the role of the intervening variable in either helping or hindering the process of communication. These are always in a position to increase or decrease the effectiveness of the communicator, the strength of the communication media, the power of the receiver, and the quality of the communicated message. Unfavorable conditions like noise, indiscipline, improper facilities, non-availability of proper aid material, etc. significantly affects communication. Apart from these, lack of expressing knowledge-appropriate communication, which occurs when a person uses ambiguous or complex legal words, medical jargon, or descriptions of a situation or environment that is not understood by the recipient. This harmonizes the process of communication. These factors which hinder the conveyance of messages of a message are known as barriers to communication. There are many barriers to communication and may occur at any stage in the communication process. Barriers may lead to your message becoming distorted and thereby risking waste of both time and or money by causing confusion and misunderstanding. Barriers to effective communication can retard or distort the message and intention of the message being conveyed, which may result in the failure of communication process or an effect that is undesirable. Effective communication involves overcoming these barriers and conveying a clear and concise message. Barriers affect communication in the following ways. First, they are hindrances which are destructive when one or more persons are interacting. They tend to diminish others' self-esteem and trigger a defensiveness, resistance, and resentment. They often lead to dependency, withdrawal, feeling of defeat, or of inadequacy. They act as feeling blockers and reduce the likelihood of finding a solution. They could ultimately lead to souring of relationships. They could lead to increasing the emotional distance between the people communicating. Barriers to communication can be classified into the following categories: physical barriers of communication, semantic barriers of communication, psychological barriers of communication, mechanical barriers of communication, cross-cultural barriers of communication, and organizational barriers of communication. Let us go through each of these barriers one by one. The first one is physical barriers, which relate to disturbance in the immediate setting that interferes in the course of an effective communication. These physical barriers may prove to be tough obstacles in the process of effective communication. These factors may just cause distraction, leading to inattentiveness, or totally alter the message, causing miscommunication. Physical barriers are as follows. The first one is time. Time has an important role in a communication process. Do we not often hear expressions such as timely caution, timely advice? These expressions include the role of time as a factor in communication. An organization that expects quick results cannot afford to be relaxed in its channel of communication. The time lag between countries in Europe, America, and Asia has to be overcome by the adoption of modern and fast communication channels. Quickness of communication is the watchword in the modern world of communication. Place. The place or the location where a communication process takes place can degenerate into a barrier to effective communication. For examples, schools situated in the middle of noisy marketplace, next to religious places or highway makes classroom communication difficult. A simple comparison of the surroundings in a government or municipal office and the ambience provided in a multinational company will show how place and surroundings play an important role in effective communication. Inconvenient place, shaky furniture, poor lighting, inadequacy of space are all factors that make people irritable, impatient and annoyed. Friction and conflict erupt easily in such places which mar communication. The impact of place in the communication process is a barrier which is inevitable. Good ambience and suitably lighted and ventilated places promote effective communication. Distance also plays an important part in determining the course of a conversation. For example, if the staff in an organization is made to sit in different buildings or different floors, they might have to substitute face-to-face communication with phone calls or emails. This prevents the employees to have effective communication with each other. For example, if a manager and his subordinate are seated at different buildings of an organization, then the manager may have to give out instructions over the phone or over the email, which can sometimes lead to lack of effective communication. Climate. The talks were held in a cordial atmosphere and in a proper climate, says the newspapers. Though the word climate refers to the human relations prevailing there, it is no exaggeration to say that the actual room's temperature helps people to keep their heads cool. Unfavorable climate can act as a barrier to communication, leading to wrong perceptions or decision. Noise is a physical barrier to effective communication. Noise may have its origin from an external source or may exist even in the communication loop. You do not achieve effective communication by merely shouting. Effective communication is almost impossible on the factory floor, the bus stand or railway station. No one should try to outshout a machine to achieve successful communication. Instead, he should choose a better place with less noise to communicate his message or information. Noise distorts messages and acts as a barrier to effective communication. Our next barrier to communication is the psychological barrier. Communication is often blocked by psychological problems. Psychological factors such as misperception, filtering, distrust, unhappy emotions, and people's state of mind can jeopardize the process of communication. Similarly, if someone has personal problems such as worries and stress about a chronic illness, it may impinge his or her communication with others. Psychological factors like interest, attention, motivation, concentration of both sender and receivers have an impact. No one can be forced to perceive what he does not want to. It could lead to a situation wherein a person would be physically present but mentally absent. Negative attitudes and prejudices mar one's participation. Positive emotions of love, compassion and we-feeling help in smooth flow of messages. Next is the semantic barrier. Language, jargon, slang, etc. are some of the semantic barriers. Language and linguistic ability may act as a barrier to communication. However, even when communicating in the same language, the terminology used in a message may act as a barrier if it is not fully understood by the receiver. Different languages across different regions represent a national barrier to communication, which is particularly important for migrating nurses. Use of jargon and slang also act as a barrier to communication. The various semantic barriers are verbosity and verbalism. At times, language used by the communicator would be too high and bookish, making it difficult to comprehend. Sometimes, inappropriate speed of talking also makes it difficult to understand the message. Language inadequacy is another semantic barrier. There might be language barrier since both the sender and the receiver do not comprehend each other's language. Also, the sender may not be proficient in the language, making his messages unclear. Unclear graphics and symbols. During written communication, if the sender uses some symbols which are not commonly used, then the receiver gets a wrong picture. In the accompanying slide, you can see a semantic problem and a syntactic problem. In the semantic problem, you can see wrong use of punctuation changes the meaning of the entire sentence. Similarly, syntactical problem also brings about unclarity of the message. The next barrier is the mechanical barrier. Mechanical communication barriers are technical sources of interference in the communication process. A mechanical barrier stems from a problem in machinery or instruments used to transmit the message. This is not limited to media forms such as radio and television. It also includes machines used by those with hearing or speech impairments. Example of mechanical communication barriers are noisy communication machines or instruments, absence of means of communication instruments, transmission interruption, and power failure. The first mechanical barrier that we see here is noise. Mechanical instruments and machines require constant maintenance. Over time and with regular use, their ability to properly function breaks down. Noisy reception interferes with their use as communication tools. Defects in the machinery may also cause noise that creates a mechanical communication barrier. Power failure. Electrically generated devices used in communication are only useful tools if there is a steady power supply. Isolated location and underdeveloped countries may depend on electricity that is generated by single source. Power failures and load shedding may mean a long period without communication in areas such as these. Any power failure may cause a mechanical communication barrier. Choice of media. Some messages may require personal communication and yet other may require use of audiovisual aids. Hence, choice of media has a substantial influence on communication. Cross-cultural barrier refers to the way in which these specific cultural components pose problems or obstacles to cultural exchange and integration. These aspects of culture are typically long-standing traditions and widely held belief for a group of people, and they can often present problems for cross-cultural interaction. Eating etiquette, religion, social practices, body language, and marriage conventions are components that are deeply ingrained in various cultures in different ways. The example on the slide clearly shows how the sign is perceived in different countries. The elements in cross-cultural barriers are language. Misunderstandings are common among people who speak the same language, so it is not surprising that people from different culture and linguistic backgrounds face communication barriers. Anything from the mispronunciation of a word to a lack of specificity can lead to misunderstandings. For example, if a sales director in New York asks a contractor in Brazil to do something soon, the two parties may have a different interpretation of the word soon. Language is a reflection of culture, and different cultures have very different ways of assigning meaning to words. Next cross-cultural barrier is behavior. Cultural differences in body language and other behaviors can also cause miscommunications. For example, in the USA, it is important to make eye contact with someone who is speaking to you, or they may think you are distracted or uninterested. However, in many Asian countries, eye contact can be seen as a sign of disrespect or a challenge to authority. There are many other cultural differences in body language that can create barriers to effective communication. These include differences in facial expressions, the use of nodding to indicate agreement or understanding, and the amount of space to give someone with whom you are having a conversation. Our next cross-cultural barrier is stereotype. Stereotypes are assumptions people make about the characteristics of members of a cultural or social group. Many stereotypes are negative or even hostile and are a serious barrier to workplace communication. For example, if you make a joke about expecting your Latin American colleague to arrive late for a meeting, you may damage your professional relationship. While some cultures may share a general set of characteristics, it is never okay to assume that individual members of a group have those same characteristics. Ethnocentrism, the tendency to judge other groups according to the standards and values of one's own group. Ethnocentric views not only act as a communication barrier but also hinder employee morale and productivity. If you come from a culture where it is important to make small talk prior to conducting business, you may consider someone who gets right to the point to be rude. However, from another cultural aspect, it is both acceptable and efficient to get right down to business. Our next barrier to communication is the organizational barrier. Unclear planning, structure, information overload, timing, technology, and status difference are the organizational factors that may act as barriers to communication. Complexity in organizational structure, that is greater the hierarchy in an organization, more are the chances of communication getting destroyed. Only the people at the top level can see the overall picture, while the people at low level just have knowledge about their own area and a little knowledge about other areas of the organization. The second organizational barrier is the rules and regulation. Strict enforcement of rules, discipline may create an atmosphere wherein communication becomes formal and rigid. The next organizational barrier is the group size. The type of communication to be used depends on the group size. A communicator cannot think of the receiver as a single mass. Each individual is different from one another, and the individual differences have an impact on the communication. Now, let us have a look at the ways to overcome these barriers. Overcoming the communication barriers require a vigilant observation and thoughts of potential barriers in a particular instance of communication. State all the anticipated barrier that may have impact on your day-to-day communication. Strategies to overcome barriers will be different in different situations depending upon the type of barriers present. Following are some of the important general strategies that will be commonly useful in all the situations to overcome the barriers of communication. To overcome the barrier to communication, we need to take the receiver more seriously. There is a need to frame crystal clear messages. We must deliver the messages skillfully. Focus should be on the receiver. Make use of multiple channels to communicate instead of relying on one channel. Ensure appropriate feedback. One must be aware of their own state of mind, emotion, or attitude. The sender must develop clarity of thought about the message to be conveyed. The thoughts must be carefully organized so that it is easier formulating a message that covers the intended thoughts clearly and completely. Consult with the intended recipient to develop a mutual understanding of all the issues involved in the subject covered by the communication. A general principle is that it is better to first understand before attempting to be understood. Use appropriate language suitable for the recipient. When communicating face to face, develop sensitivity to the body language. One should pay attention to the body language of others to understand them better. At the same time, it is also necessary to pay attention to body language of self so that it is supporting other than conflicting with verbal messages. Avoid communication under conditions of mental stress. Use appropriate method of communication, for example, face-to-face, letter, telephone call, and so on. Take care to ensure that message has been or is being transmitted correctly. Check for correct and complete receipt of message. And last but the most important, listen carefully. Communication is an important part of our world today. The ability to communicate effectively is considered as a prized quality. However, the people in the world are not alike. These differences, however, can cause problem in sending and receiving messages. Simply, these are hurdles in the path of communication, and anything that obstructs or blocks the meaning of communication are termed as barriers of communication. With this session, we have developed a thorough understanding of the barriers of communication, the effects of the barriers in communication, and the different types of barriers in communication. Hope you all had a fruitful time. Thank you.